Good day, economic students, and welcome back to our video lecture series. The purpose of this video is to examine the economics perspective in more detail. In a previous video, we already explained why the field of economics exists. Let's review quickly. On the left-hand side, economic resources, land, capital, and labor. On the right-hand side, economic wants. Human beings need food, shelter, clothing. We need health care. We need transportation. We need education, right? We also like entertainment. Businesses need machines and equipment. Governments need to provide roads and schools and police service. In the middle, there's not an equal sign. Economic wants far outpace are much greater than economic resources. Hence, we are all forced to deal with the burden of scarcity. Scarce or limited resources relative to unlimited economic wants gives rise to the field that we know as economics. So, economics is a social science. Went over this in detail earlier, but it is important to reiterate. We are studying people in the everyday business of life. Who do we mean by people? Well, there's three components of any society. Household/individuals, component 1. Businesses, component 2. And government, component 3. Households/individuals, component 1, plus businesses, component 2, are in what is known as the private sector, part of the private sector economy. Government is known as the public sector, right? So the three components of society are divided into the private and public sector. You should become familiar with these terms if you already are not familiar with these terms. So what are we doing here in economics? What's the purpose of this class, right? Well, how do we make the most efficient use of society's limited or scarce resources to maximize happiness, satisfaction of human beings' wants? It's all about making the most out of the least. Why study economics? It's a great question. Economics is the study of everything. The principles and concepts that we cover in this class apply to every event, circumstance, or issue, domestic or global. That's why it's so imperative that everyone have some background in economic thinking. If we were in a live classroom, we would have the luxury of asking a student to choose one of these topics, and we would then investigate it for a few moments to demonstrate how and why economics applies to everything. Instead, I'll just touch on these quickly, right? First, healthcare. In the United States, healthcare is 17% of GDP, gross domestic product, total economic output for the nation, GDP. In 2019, the United States economy produced roughly $21 trillion worth of goods and services. And healthcare was 17% of that total output. There's a huge debate in this country about healthcare as a right or healthcare as a benefit, and whether we should have socialized or universal healthcare or it should remain privatized. Many economic issues and arguments related to this particular principle, right? If we don't incentivize individuals to study medicine by compensating them well, will we get the most talented peoples as doctors, as surgeons? So it's a huge economic issue. Education. A better educated workforce leads to stronger economic growth. A better educated system means that we have less people incarcerated because they're not impoverished. They have more opportunity. Definitely economic issues related to those ideas. Social Security. In the 1930s, 1935, Great Depression era economics, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the United States reeling with the Great Depression, a horrific economic downturn. We did not have a social welfare net for individuals who lost their jobs. Social Security was designed in the 30s to provide a benefit for retired Americans, hardworking people who contributed 20, 30, 40 years worth of taxes into the system, that they would receive some compensation monthly to live off of until they're no longer with us. Now, why did we choose 65 as the age to receive this benefit? Well, back in the 30s, the average lifespan was about 67 years old. It's pushing 87 now. So the system was designed to compensate people for 2 years, not 20 years, right? Plus, when it was designed, for every one person receiving the benefit, there were 8 individuals working. Now we're down to less than 2 to 1 because the demographics have shifted in this nation. The baby boomers are retiring. We have a lot of people entering retirement age. How do we adjust the economics of the benefit to make this government program sustainable for the future? Right? Defense, Homeland Security, war. Well, here you go. This one's simple. The United States spends upwards of $700 billion on guns and tanks and bombs and drones and nuclear submarines. So, is that too much? Is it not enough? What are we really preparing for? Are we spending the money intelligently? Is there some wasteful spending in the program that we need to have closer oversight? The environment. We'll talk a lot about markets and free markets and supply and demand, but unfortunately, one of the ills of capitalism is that it's not always perfect. Left to their druthers, producers will unfortunately pollute the environment. How do we disincentivize these producers to act in this manner? What role does government play in protecting the environment? International trade. We discussed this very briefly when we talked about the 10 statements, but the United States had a trade deficit. In other words, economic imports were $650 billion greater than economic exports for the United States in 2019. We have a significant trade deficit. Who benefits from trade? Who loses from trade? Why is it that some industries have been completely eliminated in the United States because of globalization and trade? Energy. Now, of course, these issues are not mutually exclusive. So, for instance, healthcare and Social Security go together because in addition to receiving a benefit of a monetary benefit at 65, you also receive Medicare. It's a government healthcare system. Energy overlaps with environment, right? Fossil fuels are dirty, but they're efficient. They're extremely low cost, such as coal and natural gas, to burn to produce energy which is necessary for economic production. However, at what cost, right? How much should the government spend or fund research into cleaner sources of energy? Is nuclear completely off the table? Is it too dangerous? What are the economic costs and benefits of nuclear energy? Poverty and income distribution. You could take an entire course on this idea. Why is it that in real terms the average person's wages have not increased all that much over the last 40 years? Is there something the government can do besides taxation to redistribute income to lower poverty? Right, so a huge economic issue, poverty and income distribution. Taxes, corporate and individual taxes. We'll talk more about this later, but the idea is we all pay some taxes. Should we pay more or should we pay less? We have an election coming up in 2020 in November, and generally speaking, the idea is that if you're more of a right-leaning, conservative political mindset, you believe in lower taxes and the idea of allowing individuals to keep more of their money and the government not as involved with some of the economic redistribution. If you're a little bit more left-leaning, right, a little bit more liberal in your politics, you're more of the government should tax at a higher rate, especially the wealthy, and the government should provide some type of programs or social welfare net to assist other people. Right? Now, to some extent, economics also applies to things like stem cell, euthanasia, and abortion. So for instance, euthanasia. In Great Britain, there's a maximum level of healthcare spending for elderly people. In other words, they don't spend upwards of millions of dollars for a 90-some-year-old person who may need a hip replacement. At some point they say, well, we have to measure the quality of life and the economics of healthcare spending versus how much longer this person is going to be with us. So there's economics all around us. It's inescapable. That's why it's so important to take this class. This slide introduces the heart and soul of the economics perspective. We're going to talk about rational behavior and acting in one's own self-interest to maximize utility. We'll discuss the importance of thinking at the margin and the idea of marginal analysis, weighing marginal benefits and marginal costs. We will discuss incentives and how changing the rules of engagement or changing the rules of the game will change behavior. And finally, we will talk about how economic events create secondary effects. Rational self-interest. Adam Smith, Wealth of the Nation, 1776, wrote about this principle, rational self-interest. Rational self-interest means that a person will act to maximize their own utility, happiness, satisfaction, gratification. That term utility comes from the philosophical writings of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. You may have studied or at least heard of utilitarianism as an ethical theory. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham actually went to the painstaking process of trying to calculate or measure out in number terms how much happiness you get from every task in life. We don't have to go into that much detail. But in economic terms, Adam Smith's version of reality is that the most efficient mechanism, means, and methodology of organizing a society is that individuals should act in their own rational self-interest to maximize their utility, their happiness, their satisfaction, or gratification. Now remember, we are studying economics, social science, three components of society. Individuals/households component 1, businesses component 2, and government component 3. Remember, these principles apply to all three components. So rational self-interest also applies to businesses and to government. When we talk about rational self-interest for a business, we don't say a business acts in their own self-interest to maximize utility. Businesses act to maximize profits. And when we talk about rational behavior for the government, we assume that governments will take actions to maximize the collective utility or happiness for the citizens of their nation. So let's talk about some of the ideas related to rational behavior. An individual will act in their own self-interest to maximize utility. This does not necessarily mean that people will act the same in given similar circumstances. So for instance, 3 students graduate from high school. One graduates from high school and goes to 4-year university. One graduates from high school and goes to service, right into the military service. And one graduates from high school and decides that they will go right to work. So 3 people in similar situations, completely different outcomes as far as where they go, but they're all acting in their own self-interest. They're all acting to maximize their utilities. Doesn't mean everyone does the same thing. So utility, happiness, satisfaction, there's some subjective nature to that, right? Okay, now let's talk about another example of rational behavior. If I'm acting in my own rational self-interest to maximize my utility, let's say for instance that I really like to have a Coca-Cola with my lunch every day? Well, we know that if you buy Coca-Cola at the store, it costs much less than if you buy Coca-Cola at the vending machine, right? So if you buy Coca-Cola at a store, it costs much less than if you buy Coca-Cola at a vending machine. So if I were going to purchase Coca-Cola for my lunch, it makes sense to buy it in bulk from the supermarket. So there's a good example of somebody acting rationally, right? Now, one of the other important ideas is that rational self-interest is not the same as selfishness. That's an important caveat because often people criticize Adam Smith and capitalism when they hear this term rational self-interest, that people are just acting selfishly. Matter of fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher first and foremost. Adam Smith's first book, On Moral Sentiment, was a book about moral philosophy. The Wealth of Nations was his sequel to his ethical treatise, and in The Wealth of Nations, he explains why rational self-interest is not only economically efficient, it's also morally superior to other choices. So, for instance, two parents, mother and father, taking care of kids, are they acting in their own self-interest to maximize their utility? Absolutely, right? Parents love their kids. There's no greater love than a parent has for their children. So they give up willingly their time to help their kids. They give up willingly all of their resources. In other words, they're happy to buy their kids stuff instead of getting things for on their own behalf. So rational self-interest is not the same as selfishness. That's an important point there, right? Okay, rational behavior applies to a business. Businesses will act to maximize profits, and rational behavior will apply equally also to government. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Most decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. Let me say that again. Most decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. So what does that mean? Okay, well, let's give an example for an individual, let's give an example for a business, and for the government, so that you understand what we mean by marginal thinking, marginal analysis, and the importance of weighing marginal benefits and marginal cost. So for instance, an individual is working out 8 hours per week. This is a high school student working out 8 hours per week, right? They're thinking about increasing their weekly workout from 8 hours to 10 hours. So what's the marginal benefits? What's the additional utility, happiness, satisfaction that one receives from working out more? Well, obviously you'll be in better shape, right? You'll get stronger, quicker, faster. There's probably some mental improvement or happiness because of the endorphins that are released when you're working out. So there's definite benefit to increasing the number of hours dedicated to working out every week. However, there is definitely a cost, right? The status quo was 8 hours per week on average. Where are the extra 2 hours going to come from? So if someone starts to work out 10 hours per week as opposed to 8 hours, changing the status quo, that's 2 hours less for homework, or 2 hours less for watching Netflix, or 2 hours less for hanging out with their friends, right? So how do you know if it's a wise decision economically? It always boils down to this: marginal benefits versus marginal cost. Right? As long as the marginal benefits of the next unit of participation or consumption of a good or service is greater than or equal to the marginal cost, that next level of participation or consumption makes sense. How about for a business? Well, let's assume that a business has 10 workers employed at the moment, and they're thinking about hiring the 11th worker. What's the marginal cost of the 11th worker? Well, they're going to have to pay that 11th worker wages plus benefits, right? So they know the costs. What's the marginal benefit to the company of hiring the next worker? Well, the level of production within the factory or the plant will increase with more people working. So assuming that the business can produce and sell more units, as long as the production and sale is greater than the wages and fringe benefits for the employer or employee, that decision makes sense. Right? Businesses act with marginal thinking all of the time. They use marginal analysis, right? They might say, how many hours a day are we open? Are we open 8 hours a day? Should we open 10 hours a day? Are we open on every day of the week, or do we close on Mondays, right? So this type of thinking is important to the success of a business. It also applies to government, right? Think of a situation where you say, okay, the federal government is spending roughly $700 billion a year on military output. Should we increase that to 800 billion, or should we reduce it to 600 billion? Well, what's the marginal benefit of a better prepared military as opposed to the marginal cost of how those funds could have been spent otherwise on something such as education or research and development, right? Now, one important idea, extremely important idea about marginal analysis and marginal thinking. There can be too much of a good thing. Let me say that again. There can be too much of a good thing. What does that mean? Okay. The city of Philadelphia has a famous highway running east and west. West away from the city, east into the city, named the Schuylkill Expressway. It's called the Schuylkill Expressway because it runs along the Schuylkill River. A large portion of that waterway, the Schuylkill River, is in the city limits. It's not the most pristine body of water. It's not the cleanest of rivers in the world. So, could the Schuylkill River be made cleaner? An economist would argue that the Schuylkill River is as clean as it needs to be using marginal analysis. What does that mean? There's no doubt that we could take more resources and make the river cleaner. There's no doubt about that. The question is, at what cost? So we can't simultaneously make the Schuylkill River cleaner and spend the same amount of tax resources on education or road repair or fire and police readiness. So, in economic terms, there's too much of a good thing if we over-allocate resources towards cleaning the river at a cost of closing a school, which benefits lots of young people in the city. So there can be too much of a good thing. An important idea of marginal analysis. Incentives matter. If you change the rules of the game, people will change their behavior. Right? This plays out all the time. If you change the rules of engagement, people's behaviors will change. Let me give you a for instance. Let's assume that the federal government announces in 2021, starting January 2021, any student who graduates college with a 4.0 pays only 1% on their student loan debt, federal student loan debt. If you get a 3.5, you pay 2%. If you get a 3.0, you pay 3.5%. All right. If you get a 2.5, you pay 4%, and anything lower than a 2.5, you pay 5%. So your debt burden, your cost of carry, how much it's going to cost you to pay back the student loans, will be determined by the grades you receive in college. How would that change behavior, right? Incentives matter. Well, all of a sudden, students might take their studies more seriously because they want to have a lower debt payment when they finish college, right? All right, let me give you an example for business. The federal government decided about 18 months ago now to change the corporate tax rate. The United States had one of the higher tax rates relative to other countries. So in other words, the corporate tax rate in the United States was higher than it was in other European and South American and Asian countries. Why did we lower the tax rate? Well, because it should incentivize businesses to keep production here in the United States. Prior to that tax change, there was incentives for businesses to look elsewhere, maybe to what we call offshore their production, to produce a product in a foreign country with a lower tax rate. But leveling the playing field changes behavior, right? Incentives matter. Last idea for this video. Economic events create secondary effects. Let's revisit the same two examples we just discussed. The one for the individual about changing the rules on federal student loans and interest rates, and the one about corporate tax rates for corporations and businesses. So what would be maybe some of the economic secondary effects of if the federal government decides, hey, we're going to charge students an interest rate based on the outcome of their academics. The higher their grades, the lower their interest rates. The lower their grades, the higher their interest rates. Right? This sounds like it will create students who are more engaged and more interested in their studies. However, it could create unintended economic secondary effects. Colleges and universities are having a difficult time right now. Right? There are fewer students entering college. The cost of college has gone way up. Smaller schools are under some financial constraints here. The COVID-19 is also causing major problems for the finances of colleges and universities. If the rules were changed, a college would not want to be viewed as, a college would not want to be labeled the academically challenging school, because students might not want to go there because they'd end up paying higher interest on their student loan debt. So we might have grade inflation, right? We might have actual, instead of academics improving and students taking their studies more seriously, it might have the opposite effect where schools who are afraid of losing students, they decide, hey, let's make the classes easier. If you're a professor and you think, I don't want to be labeled as the difficult professor, I want to keep my job, I want the school to stay open, you might make the class easier, you might even grade easier. So it's interesting how economic events create secondary effects. The secondary effect of the corporate tax rule change is easy. If the United States lowers the corporate tax rate such that U.S. corporations are now on a more level playing field by keeping their production here in the U.S., that stands to improve employment opportunities for people in the United States, for citizens of the United States. We will revisit more of the economics perspective in a later video. Keep thinking like an economist.